Scott Wright, DraftCountdown.com, is going to talk a little NFL draft with us. Now, this draft is supposed to be loaded at wide receiver. Just how deep and how loaded is it? We'll talk to Scott here in just a second. Now, it's not supposed to be as good at corner. So it would behoove you maybe to get that receiver in the first round, or the corner in the first round, and maybe get a receiver in the second round where it's deeper, or do you just go best guy?
That's what they did last year, right? Big pass rusher draft, not a great offensive tackle draft, so they trade up and get the best offensive tackle.
Damn. By the way, on the other side of the break, I told you the Eagles were interviewing an offensive coordinator, Southern Cal offensive coordinator Graham Harrell. See the Texas Tech former QB?
He is.
He's on the Mike Leach tree.
Yeah, air raid.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Does that offense come into would that offense be interesting?
It's still Doug's offense.
Yeah. Well, maybe just a guy they say, look, we want more passing principles.
Perhaps.
You know?
I mean, this guy has to do something, right? This next OC.
Yeah, he's got to do something, of course.
Definitely doing something.
It'd be an interesting hire.
Adam Kaplan just tweeted, very impressive background, offensive system since he's finished playing. I remember him playing at Texas Tech. I didn't know he was the offensive coordinator at USC.
Yeah, he played in the NFL for a few years. He was with the Packers as a third stringer, maybe a backup. Very young. This is not the direction, young and college, that you thought they were going to go.
Well, we're going to be talking young and college and draft with the president of DraftCountdown.com,
good segue,
Scott Wright. And he joins us here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline as draft season is here, my friend. Welcome back for another year, pal. How are you?
I'm doing excellent. Good to be back.
Oh, I think we lost you there. You got me, Scott.
I hear you.
There
Can
we
you hear
go.
me?
There we go.
Gotcha. So welcome back for another year, man. Draft is here, and, in Philly, Eagles picking 21, so they're going to be in the mix for a couple things, and we all would imagine that wide receiver is going to come up a lot. So we want to start there with you because we've heard so much about this wide receiver class. Just how deep and how good is the wide receiver class this year?
It's really good, and everyone's talking about how good wide receiver is, but it's not necessarily at the very top. That's not to say there aren't some good players, but it's not like there's a Calvin Johnson or A.J. Green or Julio Jones. I think the class is so good because of that depth. You're going to be able to get a first-round caliber receiver in the second round, a second-round receiver in the third or fourth round, and I really think that the depth is what really stands out, and I wonder if some of these teams that need pass catchers, if they might bypass it in the first round, knowing that they're going to be able to get a really good one later. And I think the Eagles would maybe be a prime example of that, especially for the type of receiver they need. For example, I think of the guys who are most often talked about as first-round receivers, Jerry Jeudy from Alabama, CeeDee Lamb from Oklahoma, T. Higgins from Clemson. I'm not sure those guys are a fit for the Eagles, but Henry Ruggs III from Alabama, the speedster, he's exactly what the Eagles need. They need some dynamic playmaking ability. But if he's not there for the Eagles, they might be better off to go in another direction and target someone like Devin Duvernay from Texas a round or two later. So, and I could give you 5 more names that would be that fit. So Jalen Reagor from TCU, et cetera. So KJ Hamler from Penn State. So especially for the Eagles, the type of wide receiver they need, if Ruggs isn't there, which he may not be, they might be better suited to wait a little bit, even though that's, I think, clearly their most pressing need. They need speed and playmakers on offense.
So I guess the obvious question is, they're at 21. If they want a guy, there's going to be someone they're going to like there.
Right, and there's going to be good value regardless. But and right now I'm working on a new mock draft. Actually, it's coming out before I head down to Mobile for the Senior Bowl next week, and I actually have Ruggs going off the board earlier. I have him going 15 to the Broncos, so I would say it's probably 50-50 whether he's there for the Eagles at 21. But if he's not, I have them going with C.J. Henderson, the cornerback from Florida. Maybe Trayvon Diggs from Alabama. I think maybe a defensive back at that point would make more sense for Philly.
Speaking of defensive backs, is it a good class of safeties? The Eagles haven't drafted one since I was in diapers, at least high in the draft. So we're wondering if they're actually going to address this position if the draft is good enough.
It's not great. And I think the 2 guys that are in the first-round conversation are Grant Delpit from LSU, who's probably going to be a top 20 pick, and then Xavier McKinney from Alabama, who's kind of that classic field general back there, an extension of the coaching staff. Is as good of a player he is, both in coverage and supporting the run. It's those intangibles that really set him apart. And then there's some good players at safety a little bit later on that you can find in day 2, but I don't know if you're going to find that immediate impact starter. I think they're going to probably have better luck going with a corner in the first round than a safety. But if Delpit or McKinney are there and that's a position they really want to address, you almost pull the trigger on that safety knowing that there's going to be a pretty big drop-off after them. One other guy that I really like at a safety position is Antoine Winfield Jr. from Minnesota, who came out. When I first started getting into the draft, his father was one of the first players that I had the quote-unquote prospect crush on, and a very similar type of player. He's just like his pops. He's not the biggest. He's not the fastest. All he does is make big plays.
Regarding those 2 safeties, or even 3, if you want to talk also about Winfield Jr., which one of them, because the Eagles prefer, a lot of teams do, they don't like the classic in-the-box safety. They want a guy who can play some nickel, who can cover in the deep post. They want their next version of Malcolm Jenkins. So of all those guys, the 3 guys you mentioned, is one of them kind of more suited for that kind of role as opposed to another one being more one-dimensional?
Yeah, I think Delpit and McKinney are more of those classic safeties. They're well-rounded, but they're true safeties, whereas Winfield, he could play corner or safety. And I'd throw Ashton Davis from California in that mix with Winfield, too. He's going to be a day 2 pick. He's a former walk-on, really fast, high intangible kid. If you're looking for that hybrid who can kind of help out at multiple positions, I think Davis and Winfield would be more your speed, whereas Delpit and McKinney are classic safeties.
So with the wide receiver position being so deep, at least projected to be for the upcoming draft this year, what are some late round names that you see could have a lot of value? And would you advise, if you had to, the Eagles to go a different direction in the first and second round, since that position is so deep, yet it is a position of high need for them?
I think they could probably justify double dipping. I think they could. I think they have to use an early round pick on a wide receiver, but they could very easily justify coming back and get another one later on. I mentioned some of the names who I thought might be a fit early on, if not the first round. If not Ruggs in the first round, I think KJ Hamler from Penn State, Jalen Reagor from TCU could be a fit. Devin Duvernay from Texas. Those guys are all in that second, third round range. But then on day 3, John Hightower from Boise State, another speedster, kind of thin, but a real big play threat and very fast. One guy who I think is intriguing and I think is going to have a big Senior Bowl week is Van Johnson from Florida. Wasn't overly productive, but he's got NFL bloodlines. He's a son of Sean Jefferson, who played in the NFL for a long time, and reminds me in some ways, just his background-wise, to Terry McLaurin, in that he's underrated right now, but really good special teamer as well. So he's a guy to keep an eye on. So I definitely think that the Eagles can justify double dipping and bringing in a couple pass catchers in this class, but they have to bring one in early. It's just a matter, is it first round, second round, third round? But I think that's probably their top priority.
Scott, I'm curious how you view Hamler, because he's got electrifying speed and playmaking abilities. Penn State seems to use him as a slot receiver, though, and sometimes those guys get typecast as not meant to be able to play the perimeter in the NFL. Do you think that's just a function of what Penn State does and that he'll be fine as an outside receiver in the NFL, or do you have any concerns there?
Yeah, the size isn't ideal. He only comes in about 5'8.5", 176 pounds, and I think he falls in that category for comparison's sake in last year's class. Marquise Brown, who was a late first-round pick, Mecole Hardin, who went to the Chiefs in the second round. I think that's kind of his range. I think he's probably going to be a top 50 guy, and the size and whether he's a slot receiver, outside receiver, I don't know if it's as big of an issue now as it was maybe 10 years ago. I think teams are seeing the value of players like that, and in fact, they're kind of in vogue with those guys I mentioned. Thinking Tyreek Hill is not the biggest guy. The speed's more important than the size. So he's the type of weapon on offense that you'll find a role for. So I don't think it's going to really impact him as much as it might have at one time. And he's going to go, if not late on day 1, probably early to middle day 2.
Scott Wright, DraftCountdown.com, the NFL Draft, of course, the Eagles picking 21. Now, with that wide receiver spot, I do want to – how many wideouts do you project to be first-rounders?
Well, and it goes back to I talked earlier, do some of these teams wait to take advantage of that depth? I think we're going to see at least 4, and I think I have 4 going in this new first-round mock draft. The 4 guys I talked about, Judy, Lamb, Ruggs, and Higgins. But then there's a number of guys who are kind of on that edge. Hamler could be one. I think Brandon Ayuk from Arizona State Justin Jefferson from LSU, Laviska Shenault from Colorado. So I think 4 is a safe number, but I could push it up to as many as 7 or 8, depending on how the board goes. But I tend to think some of these guys are going to slide a little bit. I think teams are going to realize the depth and take advantage of that. So it might not be as many as people are expecting, but if just because they don't go in the first round doesn't mean they're not first round talents. It's just because of that depth this year, you're going to be able to get them later.
All right. Now the other spot, Jeff asked you about safety. Corner's another interesting spot here. They have, gone the middle round route for corners with, Rasul Douglas and Avonte Maddox and Jalen Mills in the 7th round. But it doesn't seem, you could obviously correct us here, but that corner is as deep this year if you need a corner.
No, it's not. And you start at the top. Jeff Okudah from Ohio State's kind of in a class of his own. He's going to be a top 3 to worst case top 10 overall pick. And then there's a drop off after him, and I think you get a tier with Trayvon Diggs from Alabama, Christian Fulton from LSU, C.J. Henderson from Florida. Then I think there's another little bit of a drop off, and you're looking at guys like Damon Arnett from Ohio State, Jalen Johnson from Utah, Jeff Gladney from TCU. So, no, I think that's a position that if you really need a corner, you probably want to get one early. And I think there's a good chance one of those top 3 or 4 guys who are projected as first-round picks are going to be there for Philly at 21. I mentioned I have them taking C.J. Henderson with their first-round pick in my new mock draft, who's a guy – not a lot of production as a ball hawk, but all the physical tools you look for. He's 6 feet tall, 200 pounds. He runs a 4.4. Everything you look for physically. So I think that the Eagles are going to stand a much better chance of getting a starting wide receiver and addressing that need beyond the first round than they are a high caliber cover guy. And if you're looking for a name on day 2 to maybe keep an eye on, Cameron Dantzler from Mississippi State. Is a guy to keep an eye on, maybe a Tony Pry Jr. from Notre Dame, even on day 3. But I think they address that early. I think in the top 3 rounds, they're going to bring in a wide receiver and a defensive back at some point. And I think if they could get C.J. Henderson at 21, I think that would be a really good fit for them.
Now, last year was the pass rusher / defensive line draft. What does it look like this year, especially for interior linemen, defensive tackles for a 4-3?
Yeah, and on the interior, you have a case where there's one guy who's the cream of the crop with an asterisk, Derek Brown from Auburn, who would have been a top 20 overall pick last year, had a better season this year, is going to go in the top 5 to 10. Then there's a drop-off, and you have a few guys who are kind of duking it out to be the next handful off the board. Javon Kinlaw from South Carolina, who's kind of a jumbo athlete who can really move around depending on scheme. Raekwon Davis from Alabama, who's just an impressive physical specimen at 6'6", 312. And James Lynch from Baylor, who doesn't get talked about a lot, but I think he's a first-round pick and just a really disruptive guy on the interior. But I think there's going to be better depth at defensive tackle this year than defensive end, and really all throughout, depending on what type of player you're looking for. You're going to be able to get a good defensive tackle, I think, in the 2nd or the 3rd round, whereas at defensive end, it kind of drops off. Certainly Chase Young is going to be a top 2 overall pick, but then you might see some guys get pushed up, but the top of this defensive end class is not great. So I think defensive tackle is probably stronger than defensive end this year, not only at the top, but the depth throughout.
Scott Wright, Draft Countdown. I want to ask you this about the running backs, considering what we're seeing with Henry. Is that position going to be more in vogue, do you think? And how is that position in this class? I mean, I don't know. We just saw
Travis Etienne
go back and how that changed some things. But what's the running back class look like? And do you think there are guys that are going to be more intriguing based on what a guy like Derrick Henry is doing right now?
Oh, I didn't even see that Travis Etienne was going back. I've been typing up the mock
Just happened.
My radar. Mm-hmm. That's kind of surprising. That really is surprising. But even without him, this is a really good class of running backs because of all the underclassmen that have come out. I think we're probably pushing 20 underclassmen running backs already. Wow. So that's always one of the strongest positions in the draft, and this year's no exception. I think the 2 guys who are likely to come off the board in the first round are J.K. Dobbins from Ohio State and DeAndre Swift from Georgia, maybe Jonathan Taylor from Wisconsin, but really good depth throughout. And whatever type of player you're looking for, there's going to be someone for you. And you mentioned Derrick Henry. I wonder if the guy who's going to be helped out by the success Derrick Henry is having is A.J. Dillon from Boston College, who's who's just under 6 feet tall, 250 pounds. He's going to work out really well. Super productive workhorse for Boston College. Maybe he gets pushed up the board a little bit. But yeah, this is going to be a really strong running back class again. And no question, all those underclassmen has really bolstered it. Just from a senior perspective, not great, but as always, the underclassmen have flooded out and really bolstered that. But ETN, had he come out, he probably would have been my number 4 running back in this class, and if not a late first rounder, probably more of a mid to second. I kind of think of him as a Dalvin Cook type of player. So, yeah, I think he probably saw that so many of his peers have come out. He decided to wait and hopefully go a little higher next year, play himself into the first round.
Scott, I'm of the mindset or the opinion that the Miami Dolphins will still take Tua with their first pick in the first round if they have the opportunity. How do you feel about Tua and where he might go?
I do as well. That's who I had going to the Dolphins in my first mock draft at number 5 overall, and I got him slotted there again. And honestly, they might have to trade up a little to get him. They might have to jump up to maybe the Lions at 3 or the Giants at 4, just to make sure they get their guy, and they have the draft capital to get that deal done. And by all accounts, this hip injury isn't going to be a long-term issue. You know, when it first happened, there was a lot of speculation, is this a Bo Jackson career-threatening type thing? That doesn't appear to be the case. But more so than this specific injury, I think the concerns are going to be just the durability in general. This isn't his first rodeo with those lower body injuries, and you just worry, is it going to be a Carson Wentz situation where he's great when he's on the field, but he's never going to be able to make it through a full season healthy? So I think that's the concern, and it's going to be a gray area. It's not going to be black and white. Every team's medical staff is going to evaluate it differently depending on their appetite for risk, but I think the Dolphins still take him as long as he checks out medically for them.
So we've been talking for years, Scott, and, you talk about the quarterback position and where you rank prospects. And, over the years, this guy is my number 1 guy I've ever scouted, or this is the best class. You got Joe Burrow at the top of this class. What kind of prospect is he? Because he's kind of interesting being a redshirt senior here. He's a little older than we typically get. I mean, but he's only played 1 year. So I find him to be a very intriguing guy to try to scout.
Yeah, no question. And if you just look at it from a tools perspective, adequate across the board in terms of the size, the athleticism, the arm strength, no deficiencies there, but not top of the mark by any stretch. What really sets him apart, though, is the intangibles. He probably ranks right up there with the very best prospects I've scouted in terms of the intangibles, that leadership ability, the leader of men, if you will, the ice water in his veins, the ability to come through in the clutch, all that stuff. And that's why he's going to be the number 1 overall pick in this draft. And it's fascinating. What a rise for him. He came into the year, he had late round grades from NFL scouts, and now he's basically a lock to be the number 1 overall pick. And I think the fact, talking about those intangibles, the fact that he transferred into LSU and immediately became an alpha dog in that extremely talented program and then really took it to another level this year, that's very impressive. And that's why he's going to be the number 1 overall pick. And that's the fun thing about the NFL draft. For the last year, all we've been talking about is Tua Tagovailoa, tank for Tua. He's going to be the number 1 pick. And here comes Joe Burrow out of nowhere, and it really changed the whole landscape.
How many first-round quarterbacks are you grading?
Well, I certainly Burrow and Tua, and then I think Justin Herbert from Oregon. I still think he's going to go in the top 10 overall. I think if the Miami Dolphins are scared of Tua's medicals, they could very easily take him at 5. They've done a lot of work on him. They like him as well. Otherwise, I think the Chargers would be a good fit at number 6 overall. The Raiders, I think, are potentially an interesting team when it comes to quarterbacks, maybe the Colts. So there's no shortage of teams in the first round that could use a quarterback. But to me, the most interesting guy at quarterback beyond Tua's situation is Jordan Love from Utah State. Still has a lot of fans in the scouting community, even though he didn't have a great final season in college. Underwent a lot of changes, a new offense, a lot of new weapons around him, and really struggled at times. But all the tools are there, and he flashes top of high first round ability at times, and I think he's one of the players who has the most to gain at the Senior Bowl next week. Even though he's a redshirt junior, he had already graduated, so he's eligible to be down in Mobile, and he's near the top of the list of guys that I can't wait to get a look at. And he could play his way into the top 15 overall picks, or he could not go in the first round altogether. So I think he's a real X factor at that position. And then Jacob Eason from Washington as well, just a one-year starter there for the Huskies, transferred from Georgia, but a former top recruit. Reminds me a little bit of Josh Allen with the Bills, just a big pocket passer with sneaky athleticism, cannon for an arm, just inconsistent and kind of raw and underdeveloped. But there's options for these teams that need a quarterback. This is a pretty good quarterback class in terms of the depth. I mean, there's legitimately probably 7-8 quarterbacks that you can legitimately envision being starters at the next level. But I think we're going to have at least 3 quarterbacks in the first round, maybe push it to as many as 4 or 5. So I guess I had to average it out and say they'll end up being 4.
You're getting us all excited. The draft is 96 days, 22 hours, 6 minutes, and 50 seconds away per Scott Wright's
TikTok.
draft. Is that Central Time Zone clock on your website there?
Yeah, it must be. Yeah, I'm in Central. I'm in Minnesota, so I think it's set to Central.
All right. So we got 1 extra hour to wait here, or 1 extra hour earlier. So it's actually only 21 hours for us here in the East. Scott Wright, the president of DraftCountdown.com. And, of course, draft season is here. That means Scott Wright is here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Thanks, Scott.
My pleasure. Anytime.